During the autopsy of a 5-year-old homeless girl, he discovers the impossible. Engraved within the child's muscle tissue, as if it had always been there, is a message. It's not a scar or an implant. It's something beyond science, a secret buried in the girl's own body waiting to be revealed. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our exciting stories. Now, continuing. Dr. Robert Mitchell never considered himself a man of easy emotions. During his 15 years as a medical examiner at the Boston Medical Examiner's Office, he had built around himself a wall of rationality that protected him from the horrors he examined daily. The precision of his reports was admired by colleagues, and his ability to remain unaffected by human tragedies had earned him the nickname Dr. Ice. On that Monday in March, rain fell incessantly over the Massachusetts capital, creating a grey curtain that blurred the outlines of the buildings. The office was an old building with austere architecture, cold corridors, and artificial lighting that never completely eliminated the shadows. Robert walked through these corridors like someone traversing familiar territory, his footsteps echoing on the polished granite floor. "Good morning, Dr. Mitchell," greeted Mrs. Zelda, the receptionist, who at 65 knew every story and secret of that place. He responded with a nod while checking the day's procedure list. His first case was the examination of an unidentified child found on the street. There were no immediate signs of violence, but authorities needed answers. "The people from Child Protective Services are already waiting in your office," informed Mrs. Zelda, adjusting her red-framed glasses. "Seems like a complicated case." Robert sighed. Cases involving children always caused a discomfort he was reluctant to admit, even to himself. They were the only occasions when his professional armor seemed to show cracks. Entering his office, he found Deborah Sanders, an experienced child welfare officer with whom he had worked on other cases. "Dr. Mitchell," she extended her hand in formal greeting. "Thank you for receiving us with such urgency." "It's my job," he replied with his usual economy of words. "What is this about exactly?" Deborah took a deep breath, adjusting her posture. A girl approximately 5 years old found sleeping in a makeshift shelter near Liberty Square. She was alone, malnourished, without documents. The initial approach was made by social services, but she doesn't speak, not a single word. Preliminary examinations indicate moderate malnutrition and possible signs of prolonged neglect. "The child passed away?" asked Robert, consulting the papers. "No, doctor." Deborah seemed surprised. "She's alive. She's currently at St. Joseph's Hospital receiving care. I need you to conduct a medico-legal assessment to document her physical condition. We need to understand the history of possible abuse to build a case that protects this child." Robert felt an immediate relief that caught him by surprise. Normally, he didn't deal with living patients. His specialty was finding answers in voiceless bodies, not silent children. "Wouldn't this be the job for a hospital pediatrician?" he questioned, hiding his discomfort under a professional tone. "We need a forensic specialist, doctor, someone who can precisely document every evidence of neglect and abuse. It's for the child's protection." He nodded, resigned. It wasn't a common procedure, but it wasn't the first time he had been called to evaluate surviving victims. He adjusted his tie and picked up his briefcase. "When should I go?" "Now, if possible. We're trying to avoid the bureaucracy that could delay necessary care." St. Joseph's Hospital was a modern complex that contrasted with the old structure of the medical examiner's office. The corridors were wide, well lit, decorated with colorful murals in the pediatric wings. Even so, Robert felt the same weight. In the air, that peculiar mixture of antiseptic and vulnerable humanity. The girl was in an isolated room, with a nurse beside her monitoring her vital signs. When Robert entered, accompanied by Deborah, his eyes were immediately drawn to the small figure lying on the hospital bed that seemed to swallow her. She was a thin child with dark brown hair framing a pale face. Her olive skin was dull, without the healthy glow of childhood. Her eyes, however, were what impressed Robert the most. Large, dark, and deeply attentive, they observed every movement with a disconcerting intensity for someone so young. "Good morning, little one," Deborah approached gently. "I brought a doctor to see how you're doing." The girl didn't respond, nor did she show any reaction. She just maintained a fixed gaze, studying the newcomers with a caution that seemed to belong to someone much older. "She's reacted like this since we found her," explained Deborah. "The psychologists suspect severe trauma or possible developmental disorder." Robert approached carefully, placing his briefcase on the auxiliary table. Something in that gaze deeply bothered him, as if the child could see beyond his professional facade. "Hello," he said, trying to soften his usually clinical tone. "My name is Dr. Robert. May I examine you?" The silence persisted, but the girl moved her head slightly in a gesture that could be interpreted as consent. Robert proceeded with the examination, meticulously, documenting each mark on her body. There were old scars on her back and arms, indicating falls or possible aggressions. Her knees had calluses consistent with long periods kneeling on hard surfaces. Her feet had marks characteristic of someone who walks barefoot over irregular terrain. What caught his attention most, however, was a peculiar birthmark on the inside of her right wrist, a small reddish mark in a shape that vaguely resembled a key. "Is this a birthmark?" he asked the nurse who accompanied the procedure. "Yes, doctor. It's registered in the initial assessment. It appears to be congenital." While photographing and documenting each detail, Robert felt a strange familiarity taking hold of him. There was something about this child in that look that awakened memories long buried in his subconscious. As a medical examiner, he had learned to block emotional connections, but something in this case was penetrating his defenses. "Do you have any clues about her identity?" he asked Deborah while putting away the photographic equipment. "Nothing yet. We're checking missing person records, but without a name or precise age, it's complicated. The few shelters in the region didn't recognize the child." Robert completed his preliminary report, detailing each evidence of neglect found. The girl, throughout the procedure, remained in absolute silence, only following each movement with those penetrating eyes. When finished, he leaned slightly toward the child. "We're done for today. You were very brave." To his surprise, the girl extended her small hand and briefly touched his fingers. The gesture, so simple and unexpected, sent an electric current through Robert's body. For a fleeting moment, he had the impression that something important was happening, something that surpassed the simple doctor-patient interaction. "She hasn't done that with anyone until now," murmured Deborah, clearly surprised. Robert stepped back, uncomfortable with his own reaction. He quickly recomposed himself, resuming his professional posture. "I'll send the complete report by tomorrow," he said, heading for the door. "It includes all physical evidence of prolonged neglect. There are no signs of sexual abuse, fortunately." "Thank you, Doctor." Deborah accompanied him out of the room. "What do you think? As a medical examiner, have you seen cases like this before?" Robert hesitated. What he thought wasn't strictly professional. It was an intuition, something he would normally dismiss as irrelevant. "There's something unusual about her behavior. The silence doesn't seem to be just trauma. It seems deliberate, as if she were observing, evaluating." "Evaluating what?" "I can't say," he admitted, uncomfortable with his own imprecision. "Just an impression, nothing that should appear in the report." On the way back to the medical examiner's office, the image of that child wouldn't leave his thoughts. The key-shaped mark, the penetrating look, the unexpected touch. There was something familiar about her that deeply disturbed him. That same night in his apartment in Beacon Hill, Robert couldn't sleep. The silence of the apartment, which normally calmed him after exhausting days, now seemed oppressive. He got up and went to his study, where he kept a small wooden box with old photographs, one of the few ties he still maintained with his past. Among the images, yellowed by time, there was a specific one he hadn't looked at in years, a photograph of a young woman holding a newborn baby. Lauren, his sister, and little Sophie, his niece. Both had disappeared 15 years ago in circumstances never clarified. The police treated the case as a voluntary escape, since Lauren faced financial problems and had gotten involved with suspicious people. Robert never accepted this version. For years he searched for clues, hired private investigators, but eventually the absence of results led him to a reluctant acceptance. Looking now at the photograph, his eyes fixed on a detail. On the baby's wrist, partially visible, was a small reddish mark. The phone rang, startling him. It was an unknown number. "Dr. Mitchell." Deborah's voice sounded tense. "Sorry to call at this hour, but we need you to come to the hospital immediately." "Did something happen to the girl?" he asked, already reaching for his coat. She spoke. "Doctor, just one word," repeated several times. "What word?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Robert." "She's repeating your name." The air suddenly seemed scarce in the apartment. How could that child know his name? He hadn't formally introduced himself, although he had briefly mentioned Dr. Robert. "I'm on my way," he replied, hanging up. Before leaving, he looked again at the photograph in his hands, at the mark on the baby's wrist, identical to the one he had seen that afternoon. The coincidence was too disturbing to ignore. Sophie would be almost 20 now, not 5. It was impossible that this child was his missing niece. However, that mark, that look, there was a connection, and he needed to discover what it was. The rain continued to fall over Boston when Robert left the apartment. The streets mirrored the city lights, creating a liquid labyrinth through which his car advanced. As he drove, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. A fragile and irrational hope, but one that pulsed with enough force to push away, at least temporarily, the ice that had inhabited his heart for so long. The medical examiner who had dedicated his life to speaking for the dead was now heading to meet a living child who somehow inexplicably seemed to know him, a child whose silence held secrets that could finally answer the questions that had tormented him for 15 years. As he parked in front of the hospital, Robert knew he was about to cross a boundary. What he would find on the other side could forever change his carefully structured life. And for the first time in many years, the prospect of that change didn't frighten him. On the contrary, he felt strangely prepared, as if his entire existence had been merely a path to this moment, to this encounter. With that thought, he crossed through the automatic doors of the hospital, leaving behind the rain and carrying with him the photograph of a child he had long believed lost forever. When Robert entered the hospital room, the scene he found left him momentarily speechless. The small girl was sitting up in bed, with her back straight and eyes fixed on the door, as if she had been waiting for him. At her side, Deborah was speaking quietly with Dr. Lucy Patterson, head of pediatrics, whose expression revealed a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dr. Mitchell," Deborah turned to him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." The pediatrician approached, extending her hand in greeting. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm Lucy Patterson. Sorry for the late call, but we have an unusual situation here." "The counselor informed me that the girl spoke," said Robert, his eyes inevitably drawn to the silent child on the bed. "Yes, and in a very specific manner," replied Dr. Patterson, consulting her notes. Around 10:15 p.m., the nurse was checking her vital signs when the child held her arm and said with absolute clarity, "Robert needs to know." She repeated this 3 times before returning to silence. A chill ran down Robert's spine. The girl not only knew his name, but had a message for him. "Robert needs to know what?" he questioned, more to himself than to the women present. Dr. Patterson shook her head slightly. She didn't complete the phrase. Just those 3 words, repeated in the same way. After that, she returned to complete silence. Her child psychologist tried to establish communication for more than an hour, without success. Robert approached the bed, feeling strangely vulnerable under the girl's fixed gaze. Her large, dark eyes seemed to contain an improbable wisdom for such a small child. "Hello again," he said, sitting in the chair near the bed, deliberately placing himself at the child's visual level. "I'm Dr. Robert. I heard you spoke my name." The girl continued in silence, but her eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Robert noticed that she slightly relaxed her shoulders, as if his presence brought some kind of relief. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. Silence. The child only studied him, as if assessing his trustworthiness. Slowly, Robert took from his pocket the photograph he had brought from home, the image of his sister Lauren, holding baby Sophie. Carefully, he placed it on the bed, within the girl's reach. "Do you know anyone in this photo?" The child's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of emotion she had shown. Her small fingers touched the photograph with surprising delicacy, tracing the outline of the woman's face. "That was my sister, Lauren," explained Robert, feeling his throat tighten. "And the baby is my niece, Sophie. They disappeared many years." "Gohi." A long moment passed while the girl continued to examine the photograph. Then something extraordinary happened. She turned her wrist, exposing the key-shaped mark, and placed it next to the photograph as if establishing a connection between both. Deborah and Dr. Patterson observed in silence, clearly intrigued by the interaction. Robert felt his heart accelerate. It was impossible that this child was Sophie. The age didn't correspond at all, but there was an undeniable connection that was beyond his rational comprehension. "Sophie would be almost 20 now," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the emotional storm assailing him. "But you have the same mark she had as a baby." The girl nodded slightly, the first gesture of deliberate communication. Her lips moved, forming silent words that Robert couldn't decipher. "What was that?" he asked, leaning closer. "The key," whispered the child, her voice as soft as the brush of a feather. "The key that opens." The three words hung in the air like an invocation. Deborah let out a surprised exclamation, while Dr. Patterson quickly noted something in her chart. "What key?" asked Robert, struggling to maintain composure. "What does it open?" The girl touched her own forehead and then pointed to Robert. "Memory," she said with unexpected clarity. "Your memory." It was as if lightning had struck Robert. A fragment of memory, long buried, suddenly emerged. Lauren, in the days before her disappearance, talking excitedly about a research project, something related to transferable hereditary memories. At the time, he dismissed it as delusions from his sister, who had always been fascinated by alternative scientific theories. Now, before this enigmatic child, those conversations acquired new meaning. "Who are you?" he asked, feeling a lump in his throat. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "Nina," she finally answered. "My name is Nina." That was enough for that night. After pronouncing her name, the girl leaned back against the pillows, apparently exhausted by the effort of communication. Dr. Patterson insisted it was time to let her rest, and Robert didn't protest. His own body seemed heavy with the impact of that brief dialogue. In the corridor, Deborah and the doctor bombarded him with questions he couldn't answer. How did the girl know his name? What did her talk about memory mean? What was the connection with the photo of his family? "I don't have answers," he admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I intend to find out. I need you to keep me informed about any developments." Dr. Patterson stopped him before he left. "I don't want to sound alarmist, but something very unusual is happening here. This child's cognitive development doesn't correspond to what's expected for her age. The clarity of speech, the choice of words, the conceptual complexity. It's as if she was someone older in a child's body," Robert completed, verbalizing the thought that also haunted him. The doctor nodded, visibly uncomfortable with her own conclusion. "I'll request more detailed neurological exams. Perhaps there's some medical explanation for this behavior." The next morning, Robert was back at the hospital. He hadn't been able to sleep. He'd spent the night researching in the digitized archives of the office about rare cases of accelerated cognitive development and revisiting his memories about the last weeks before Lauren's disappearance. His sister worked as a research assistant at Harvard University in the neuroscience department. She had always been brilliant, but eccentric in her theories. In the months preceding her disappearance, she had become progressively more reserved about her work, mentioning only vaguely a revolutionary breakthrough in the field of genetic memory. At the hospital reception, Robert encountered a familiar face, Mark Vega, his old college friend who now worked as a police investigator. "Mark, what are you doing here?" The middle-aged man, with grey hair at the temples and shrewd eyes, turned with a tired smile. "Work, my friend. I received a report about an unidentified child and possible signs of abuse." Standard procedure. Robert felt a twinge of apprehension. The presence of the police would complicate things. I did the forensic examination yesterday. There's no indication of abuse, just neglect and malnutrition. We're trying to identify her. Mark studied him with curiosity. We? Since when does a medical examiner get involved in identifying living patients? It's a special case, replied Robert, reluctant to share his still unconfirmed suspicions. The child welfare officer requested my continued assistance. Mark didn't seem convinced. Robert, we've known each other long enough for me to know when you're hiding something. What's so special about this child? Before he could answer, Deborah appeared in the hallway, her face showing concern. Dr. Mitchell, I'm glad you're here. Nina is asking for you. Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Nina? I thought the child hadn't been identified. She said her name last night, explained Deborah quickly. Dr. Mitchell, you'd better come now. She's different today. The three followed through the corridors to the room where Nina was. Upon entering, Robert immediately noticed the change. The girl was sitting on the bed, drawing intensely on sheets of paper, her movements quick and precise, nothing like the typical drawings of a 5-year-old child. Nina looked up when they entered, her eyes fixing on Robert with a disturbing intensity. You took a long time, she said, her voice firmer than the night before. We need to talk. Mark gave Robert a surprised look, clearly impressed with the child's articulation. You are? Nina asked, studying the police officer. Investigator Mark Vega, he replied, approaching cautiously. And you are Nina? The girl nodded, but her focus remained on Robert. Did you find it? She asked. Find what? Robert approached, noticing the drawings scattered across the bed, complex schemes, strange symbols, and what appeared to be the floor plan of a building. The blue folder. In her apartment. The world seemed to freeze around Robert. Lauren kept all her research in blue folders, meticulously organized in her office. It was such a specific, such a personal detail that no one other than close family members could know. How do you know about the folder? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Nina looked at the adults in the room as if assessing whether she could trust them. Then, with a sigh that seemed to belong to someone much older, she picked up one of the drawings and handed it to Robert. It was a portrait, simple but frighteningly accurate, of Lauren. Not the Lauren from the photograph he had shown, but Lauren as he had seen her for the last time. Short hair, deep dark circles under her eyes, the recent scar on her chin that she had gotten in a laboratory accident. How? Words failed him, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. She sent me, said Nina, her small voice contrasting with the weight of her words, to find you, to continue the work. A stunned silence took over the room. It was Mark who broke the spell, his police training asking the obvious questions that shock prevented Robert from formulating. Nina, who sent you? Where is this person now? Do you know your full last name? The girl ignored the questions, keeping her eyes fixed. On Robert, we don't have much time. They'll notice soon. The blue folder has everything you need to know. The address is in my drawing, apartment 302. Robert immediately recognized the address. It was the last place where Lauren had lived before disappearing. The apartment had been investigated by the police at the time, and then emptied and rented to other people. That the folder would still be there after so many years seemed impossible. Nina, Lauren's apartment was emptied 15 years ago, he explained gently. The Phi. Girl shook her head impatiently. It's not in the apartment. It's in the wall between apartments 302 and 304. She built a hiding place. Nobody found it. Mark looked from Nina to Robert, his expression increasingly intrigued. Robert, who is this Lauren you're talking about? My sister, he answered, without taking his eyes off Nina. She disappeared 15 years ago with my newborn niece. And you think this child has some connection to that disappearance? Mark asked the question carefully, his professional tone not managing to hide his incredulity. Before Robert could answer, Nina extended her wrist, showing the key-shaped mark. The connection is here, and here, she touched her temple. Ask him about Project Mnemosyne. The name hit Robert like a physical punch. Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. Lauren had mentioned this name once in one of her last phone calls, talking excitedly about a significant advance in the project, but refusing to give details over the phone. Mark noticed his friend's reaction. "You know this project?" "Just the name," admitted Robert. "Lauren mentioned it briefly before disappearing. I never found out what it was exactly." Nina began to gather her drawings, organizing them in a specific sequence. Project Mnemosyne studied memory transfer through epigenetic modifications, memories that can be passed genetically from one generation to another. The words flowed from her with a technical precision absolutely incompatible with her apparent age. Deborah and Mark exchanged alarmed looks, while Robert felt his world crumbling under the pressure of these impossible revelations. "The project was a success," continued Nina, her small voice carrying the weight of vast knowledge. "But there were people who wanted to use the research for other purposes. Lauren refused. She had principles." "What happened to her?" Robert finally managed to ask the question that had tormented him for 15 years. Nina's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine demonstration of childish emotion. She had to hide. She took Sophie with her. But before, Nina hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "Before, she created me, to find you when it was safe." "Created you?" repeated Mark, visibly confused. "What does that mean?" Nina looked at the investigator with impatience. "I am a receptacle. I contain her memories, specific fragments that she transferred. Not all, just enough to complete the mission." The statement was so absurd, so scientifically impossible, that it should have been immediately dismissed. However, there was a conviction in her words, a precision in the details she knew that made it impossible for Robert to completely ignore it. "Robert, this is crazy," murmured Mark, pulling his friend to a corner. "This child needs psychological help, not someone feeding whatever this is." "I know how it sounds," replied Robert, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "But she knows things, Mark, things that nobody could know. Coincidences, or someone instructed this child very well," the police officer insisted. "Think rationally, you're a scientist." Robert nodded, trying to recover his professional objectivity. Mark was right. There were more plausible explanations for Nina's knowledge than genetic memory transfer, a technology that bordered on science fiction. However, when he turned back to the bed, Nina was observing him with an expression that mixed urgency and disappointment, as if she could read his hesitation. "On the day Lauren disappeared, she said, her voice low but firm, you received a message from her, just 2 words, trust Mnemosyne. You never told anyone about that, not even the police." Robert's blood froze in his veins. It was true. Lauren's last communication had been that enigmatic message, which he had kept to himself, fearing he would seem crazy if he mentioned it during the investigations. Deborah, who had been observing the interaction in silence, finally intervened. "I think we all need a moment to process what's happening here. Nina needs to rest, and you two," she looked at Robert and Mark, "clearly have a lot to discuss." "There's no time," insisted Nina, her voice suddenly frantic. "They're monitoring. If they realize we're connecting the dots—" "Who's monitoring, Nina?" asked Mark, his police instinct awakening. The girl didn't respond directly. Instead, she handed Robert the last of her drawings, a stylized symbol that resembled an eye inside a triangle, Prometheus Institute. They initially funded the project. When Lauren discovered their true objectives, she sabotaged the research and fled with the crucial data. Mark wrote down the name, his expression now more serious. "I'll check if there's any record of this institute." "You won't find anything official," said Nina with a disturbing certainty. "They operate through subsidiaries, front foundations. The blue folder has everything, names, dates, connections." Robert carefully kept Nina's drawings, his scientific mind struggling against the irrationality of what he was witnessing, but unable to ignore the evidence before him. "I'll check the hiding place you mentioned," he said finally. "If the folder is there—" He didn't complete the sentence, uncertain about what this would mean. If the folder really existed in the location indicated by Nina, how to explain her knowledge? And more importantly, what would this reveal about the whereabouts of Lauren and Sophie? Nina visibly relaxed, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. "Finally," she whispered, leaning back against the pillows. "She said you would understand, that you would complete what she started." As Robert and Mark left the room, followed by Deborah, a charged silence hung between them. In the corridor, the investigator was the first to speak. "This is insane, you know that, right? Genetic memory transfer, secret institutes, sounds like a conspiracy movie script." "I know," agreed Robert, "but I'm going to check the hiding place. Anyway, I need to be sure." Mark sighed, resigned. "And I'm going with you. If there's any chance, however remote, that this is connected to your sister's disappearance, it's my duty to investigate. Besides," he added with a tired smile, "someone needs to ensure you don't completely lose your mind in this story." They walked toward the hospital exit. Robert cast a last glance at the corridor leading to Nina's room. Something had changed within him. The pragmatic medical examiner, who believed only in the concrete evidence he could observe and measure, was now on the edge of an abyss of possibilities that defied his rational understanding of the world. However, for the first time in 15 years, he felt that he was closer to discovering what had happened to Lauren and Sophie. And if that meant questioning everything he believed he knew about the nature of memory, consciousness, and identity itself, then he was willing to take that leap into the unknown. With that determination, he stepped out into the daylight, ready to find the answers that Nina promised, even if they were hidden in the walls of an abandoned apartment or in the mysterious depths of the human mind. The old building in downtown Boston seemed frozen in time. The peeling facade and poorly lit corridors evoked memories of a distant era when Lauren lived there. Robert and Mark climbed the 3 flights of stairs in silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. On the 3rd floor, Robert stopped in front of apartment 302, his heart pounding against his chest. A "For Rent" sign was nailed to the door, suggesting the place was empty. Mark inspected the empty corridor. "I think we need to find the building manager or the superintendent," he suggested. "If we try to enter without authorization..." Robert was already kneeling in the corridor, his fingers tracing the wall between apartments 302 and 304, exactly where Nina had indicated. "Lauren was always brilliant at improvised solutions," he murmured, pressing different points on the wall. "If she really created a hiding place here..." His fingers found a slight irregularity in the baseboard. Pressing harder, he felt something give under the pressure. With an almost inaudible click, a small section of the baseboard detached, revealing a hidden space in the wall cavity. "Unbelievable," whispered Mark, watching Robert cautiously insert his hand into the opening. For a moment, his fingers found nothing but dust and small fragments of plaster. Then, they touched something solid. Carefully, Robert pulled out the object, a blue plastic folder, exactly like the ones Lauren used to organize her research. "It's impossible," murmured Mark, disbelief etched on his face. "How could that child know about this?" Robert didn't respond. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside, he found dozens of pages of notes in his sister's unmistakable handwriting, complex diagrams, photographs, and a small device that looked like a specialized flash drive. "We need to examine this in a safe place," he said, closing the folder. "If what Nina said is true and there are people monitoring..." A noise at the end of the corridor interrupted his speech. Both turned to see a man in a dark suit standing there, observing them with a neutral expression. There was something unsettlingly artificial about his posture. "Dr. Robert Mitchell," asked the man, advancing a few steps. "And Investigator Mark Vega, what a coincidence to find you here." Mark instinctively put his hand to his waist, where he carried his gun. "Who are you?" he demanded, positioning himself slightly in front of Robert. "My name isn't important," replied the man, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm here representing people interested in the work your sister left unfinished, Dr. Mitchell, work that we believe you're about to resume." Robert pressed the folder against his chest, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the stranger. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, trying to buy time. The man sighed, as if dealing with stubborn children. The child spoke to you, the receptor, Lauren's most successful experiment. Nina is not an experiment, protested Robert, surprised by his own defensive reaction. Ah, so she already has a name. Interesting how the bond formed quickly, commented the man. Lauren predicted this. She was always brilliant at understanding human emotional patterns. Mark stepped forward, his tone official and authoritative. Sir, I'm going to need you to identify yourself now. I'm conducting an official investigation. The man merely smiled. The girl is an aberration investigator, a partially successful memory transfer experiment. She contains selected fragments of Lauren Mitchell's memories, implemented through epigenetic modifications in a genetically modified embryo. The words fell in the corridor like stones, each one hitting Robert with physical force. What the man described was so scientifically advanced that it bordered on the impossible, and yet it explained the inexplicable, how Nina knew details that nobody could know. This is absurd, said Mark, but his voice betrayed uncertainty. Science often seems absurd before becoming consensus, replied the man, taking another step in their direction. Project Mnemosyne was decades ahead of its time. Lauren realized this. That's why she sabotaged the project and fled with the most important data. Where is my sister? Asked Robert, his voice almost a whisper. The man hesitated, as if considering how much he should reveal. Lauren is safe for now. She gave us quite a lot of trouble during all these years. She managed to keep herself hidden efficiently, but now... His eyes fell on the folder that Robert was holding. Now she made a mistake by sending the girl, by creating this connection. Her research must return to the Prometheus Institute, where it belongs. So it's true, murmured Robert. The Institute, the project, everything Nina mentioned. The child is a prodigy, no doubt, agreed the man. But also an incomplete experiment, unstable. The transferred memories are deteriorating. Soon she'll begin to lose coherence. The fragments will disintegrate, causing irreversible neurological damage. She needs our specialized care. Something in the way the man spoke aroused Robert's distrust, an excessive calmness, an arrogant certainty. If what you say is true, why would Lauren send her to me? Why not seek professional help? Because we are the only ones who truly understand what she is, replied the man. And because your sister knew that you, with your scientific background, would be capable of continuing her work, completing the research, stabilizing the process. Mark observed the conversation with growing alarm. Let's get out of here, Robert, he murmured. This man is obviously not in his right mind. On the contrary, investigator, the man smiled. I'm perfectly lucid, but now I need you to hand over the folder and tell me where the child is. No, replied Robert, surprising himself with the firmness of his voice. Whatever Nina may be, she trusted me, and if there's a chance, however small, that my sister is alive, I won't betray that trust. The man's smile disappeared. I'm afraid you don't understand the situation, Dr. Mitchell. I'm not making a request. His hand slid inside his jacket, but before he could draw whatever was hidden there, Mark advanced with the agility of someone trained for confrontational situations. In seconds, the man was immobilized against the wall, while the investigator conducted a complete search, finding a weapon that he carefully removed. Threatening a police officer and a medical examiner, said Mark, handcuffing the man. You've just guaranteed yourself a long conversation at the police station. You have no idea who you're dealing with, growled the man, his mask of civility completely dissolved. The Institute has connections you can't imagine. I'll be free before nightfall. Maybe, agreed Mark, but until then, we'll have time to verify every word you said. While Mark escorted the man down the stairs, making a call to request backup, Robert remained standing, the blue folder firm in his hands, his mind processing the implications of what he had just heard. If what the man said was true, Nina wasn't just a special child. She was something much more complex, a scientific miracle, an ethical aberration, a window to his lost sister. 2 hours later, Robert was back at the hospital, the blue folder now secure in a locked briefcase. Mark had taken the man in for formal interrogation, promising to keep Robert informed. On the way to the hospital, He had managed to read only part of the folder's contents, but enough to confirm the incredible. Lauren had really participated in the development of a revolutionary epigenetic memory transfer technology. Her notes described how certain memory patterns could be genetically encoded and transferred to receptor organisms, especially in initial embryonic stages. The research had begun with the noble objective of preserving memories of people with neurodegenerative diseases, but the Prometheus Institute had quickly redirected the project to less ethical applications, creating individuals programmed with specific memories and knowledge, perfect soldiers, undetectable spies, agents who carried valuable information without even knowing they possessed it. Lauren had sabotaged the project when she realized the extent of its military applications. Her last record spoke of a planned escape, taking with her not only the crucial data, but also Sophie, her newborn daughter who, Robert now suspected, could have been part of the experiments. As for Nina, the final pages contained cryptic notes about a contingency receptacle, a plan B in case something happened to Lauren and Sophie, a means of ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost, but also would not fall into the wrong hands. Upon arriving at Nina's room, Robert found the girl sleeping peacefully, with Deborah seated at her side. She had a mild seizure an hour ago, informed the child welfare officer, her voice laden with concern. The doctors say it could be stress or exhaustion. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. The man in the suit had mentioned deterioration, neurological damage. What if he was telling the truth about that? Did the tests show anything? Nothing conclusive yet. Electroencephalogram showed some irregularities, but nothing that explains the behavior or the seizures. Deborah studied Robert's tense face. "You found something, didn't you? The folder she mentioned." He nodded, sitting in the chair next to the bed. "It's more complicated than we imagined, Deborah, much more." While summarizing his discoveries, for the counselor, omitting the more sensitive details, Robert observed Nina's sleeping face. Who was she really? A child with a rare neurological condition who somehow accessed information she shouldn't know, or something more, something that defied current scientific understanding. "What does this mean for her?" asked Deborah when he finished. "For her future?" "I don't know," admitted Robert, "but I'll find out. I owe it to her. And to Lauren." As if sensing she was being observed, Nina slowly opened her eyes. Seeing Robert, a small smile illuminated her tired face. "You found it?" It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Yes," he replied, leaning closer, "and I also found some answers. But I have more questions now." Nina tried to sit up, and Robert gently helped her, adjusting the pillows to support her. "You think I'm strange," she said, not as an accusation but as a simple observation. "That I'm not normal." "I think you're extraordinary," corrected Robert, carefully choosing his words, "and that you deserve to understand who you are and where you came from, just as much as I need to understand what happened to my sister." Nina nodded as if she expected this answer. "The folder explains the procedure, how she transferred memory fragments to me. Not everything, just enough." "Enough for what, Nina?" "To complete the sequence," she replied, her voice suddenly weaker. "To neutralize the project, so no one else can use the technology in the wrong way." Robert realized something was wrong. Nina's skin was pale, her eyes slightly unfocused. "Are you feeling well?" he asked, alarmed. "The memories are fragmenting," she replied with a disconcerting calmness. "It was expected. Lauren knew it would be temporary. That's why she needed to find you quickly." Deborah was already calling the nurse while Robert held Nina's small, fragile hand. "How can I help?" he asked, desperate. Nina smiled, a sad and wise smile that no 5-year-old child should be capable of expressing. "In the folder. The USB device contains the stabilization protocol. You'll need specialized equipment. Neuroscience laboratory." "Harvard," murmured Robert, remembering that his sister worked there. "I can contact her former colleagues." Nina nodded, her eyes beginning to close again. "If it works, the memories will be stabilized. If not," she hesitated, I'll continue being me, just without Lauren's memories." The nurse entered, immediately checking Nina's vital signs and administering medication through the IV. Robert was gently moved aside while the medical team took over. In the corridor, leaning against the cold wall of the hospital, he opened the briefcase again, removing the USB device mentioned by Nina. It looked ordinary except for the engraved symbol, a stylized key, similar to the birthmark on the girl's wrist. A week later, Harvard's neuroscience laboratory was exceptionally busy for a Saturday. Professor Dr. Camila Rodriguez, an old colleague of Lauren's, had responded to Robert's call with surprising promptness. "I never believed that Lauren simply ran away," she said, while preparing the advanced electroencephalography equipment. "She was too brilliant, too committed to her research to abandon everything without reason." Nina was sitting quietly in a special chair, electrodes carefully fixed to her scalp. In the last few days, her seizures had increased in frequency and intensity. Her periods of lucidity were getting shorter, and when she spoke, she frequently mixed information, confused times, lost her train of thought. The protocol contained in the USB device was complex, involving specific brain stimulation combined with personalized pharmacological treatment. In theory, it should stabilize the epigenetic modifications that allowed Nina to access Lauren's memory fragments, preventing their degradation. "It's fascinating from a scientific point of view," commented Dr. Rodriguez, reviewing the data on the computer. "But ethically, Lauren must have been desperate to resort to this." "She was," agreed Robert. "The Prometheus Institute cornered her, used her research for purposes she never approved. Creating Nina was her last resort to ensure the truth wouldn't be lost." Mark, who was observing from a corner of the laboratory, still seemed skeptical. "The man we arrested didn't say much, even under formal interrogation. But we were able to confirm that the Prometheus Institute exists, or existed, as a subsidiary of an international pharmaceutical conglomerate. It was officially dissolved 12 years ago, following accusations of unethical practices in undocumented research." "And Lauren?" asked Robert, the question that incessantly tormented him. Mark shook his head. "We still don't have concrete leads, but we've broadened the search now that we have more information. If she's somewhere—" "I'm ready," announced Nina, her small but determined voice interrupting the conversation. All eyes turned to her. Even connected to dozens of wires and sensors, there was a dignity in her posture that moved Robert. This child, regardless of how and why she was created, demonstrated a courage that many adults didn't possess. "The procedure will last approximately 2 hours," explained Dr. Rodriguez, checking the equipment one last time. "You'll be conscious throughout the process, but you may feel some discomfort. If it becomes too intense, let us know immediately." Nina nodded, her eyes meeting Robert's. "And if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "Then I'll continue being just Nina," she replied with simplicity. "And that's okay. Lauren knew it was a possibility. She left instructions for that case too." Robert approached, kneeling to be at eye level with the girl. "Whatever the outcome, you won't be alone, I promise." The procedure began with the careful administration of a combination of medications developed by Lauren, followed by the activation of the brain stimulation protocol. The monitors recorded each alteration in Nina's neural activity, while Dr. Rodriguez adjusted parameters with surgical precision. During the first hour, nothing extraordinary happened. Nina remained calm, periodically responding to the doctor's control questions. In the second hour, however, the brain patterns began to change dramatically. "We're seeing significant neural reorganization," murmured Dr. Rodriguez, studying the readings with scientific fascination. "It's as if different regions of the brain were establishing new connections, consolidating patterns." Nina closed her eyes, her breathing becoming deeper. For an alarming moment, her entire body tensed as if suffering a silent seizure. Then, as suddenly as it started, she completely relaxed. "Nina," called Robert, alarmed. Slowly, she opened her eyes. For a fleeting instant, Robert had the disconcerting impression of seeing Lauren looking through those childish eyes. "It worked," said Nina. her voice firmer than it had ever been. The memories are stable now. The following hours were dedicated to meticulous tests, confirming that Nina's neurological functions had stabilized. Her ability to access the transferred memories seemed intact, but now there was a clear separation between what were Lauren's memories and what were Nina's own experiences. "It's like having a library in my head," she explained, while Dr. Rodriguez carefully removed the electrodes. "I can access the knowledge, but I know they're not my experiences. I don't get confused anymore." 3 months later, the Boston Botanic Garden offered a respite of tranquility amid the hustle of the city. Robert walked slowly along the tree-lined paths with Nina at his side, firmly holding his hand. The temporary guardianship had been granted without difficulties, especially after Deborah's intervention in the process. "Did they find anything else about the Institute?" asked Nina, while watching butterflies dancing among the flowers. "Mark managed to track down some of their former facilities," replied Robert. "They found partial documentation about Project Mnemosyne, enough to confirm everything you told us." "And about Lauren and Sophie?" Robert smiled, a smile that mixed hope and caution. "There are indications that they might be abroad, maybe Canada. The investigators are following some promising leads." Nina nodded, satisfied. In the last months, as her condition stabilized, she became increasingly like a normal child. Lauren's memories remained accessible, but they no longer dominated her personality. She had begun to develop her own interests, her own preferences. She had started formal schooling, surprising her teachers with the speed of her learning, but also demonstrating the insecurities and joys proper to any child. The adaptation hadn't been easy for either of them. Robert, accustomed to solitude and routine, had to completely reorganize his life to accommodate the needs of a small child. Nina, in turn, needed to learn to be just a girl after having carried the weight of adult memories and an extraordinary mission. There had been months of intensive therapy, medical consultations, and constant adaptations. Robert's apartment now housed a small children's library, a space for drawings and paintings, and even a telescope, the first genuinely personal interest that Nina had developed. "If we find Lauren and Sophie," asked Nina as they sat on a shaded bench, "what happens to me?" The question hit Robert like a punch to the stomach. Amid all the agitation and adaptation, he had never explicitly considered this possibility. "What do you mean?" Nina shrugged, feigning casualness, but her eyes revealed her anxiety. "They're your real family. I'm just... well, you know what I am." Robert felt a lump in his throat. How to explain to this extraordinary child how important she had become to him, how to make her understand that, regardless of how she had entered his life, she was now an irreplaceable part of it. "Nina," he said, carefully choosing his words, "family isn't defined just by blood or origin. If we find Lauren and Sophie, they'll also be your family. Nothing will change between us." "Promise," she insisted, childish, vulnerability clearly visible on her face. "I promise," he replied, with a certainty that came from the depths of his heart. "Besides, you're the only one who can appreciate my bad anatomy jokes." Nina laughed, the crystalline sound of her laughter echoing among the trees, momentarily scaring away all the ghosts of the past that still haunted them. "That one about the skeleton in the closet was especially terrible," she teased. As they continued their walk, Robert reflected on the extraordinary journey they had traveled in the last few months, from an emotionally distant medical examiner to the guardian of an exceptional child. From a man obsessed with the past to someone who now looked to the future with renewed hope. The mystery of Lauren and Sophie was still not completely solved. The Prometheus Institute, although officially dissolved, possibly still operated in the shadows through new entities. The revolutionary science that had allowed Nina's existence remained a secret guarded by few for safety. But amid these persistent uncertainties, one truth had crystallized. In the desperate search for answers, Robert had found something he didn't know he was looking for. A second chance to build a family, to heal old wounds, to rediscover the capacity to care deeply for someone. When they reached the section of the garden dedicated to medicinal plants, Nina released his hand and ran ahead, her yellow dress shining under the afternoon sun like a small flame of life and hope. She knelt to examine a plant, her face illuminated by the genuine curiosity that now defined her personality more than any inherited memories. "Dr. Mitchell, come see this one. The sign says it can help people with memory problems." He smiled, walking to her. Fate had a peculiar sense of irony, he thought. The man who had dedicated his life to dealing with death now found himself totally dedicated to protecting a life. The medical examiner who documented people's last vestiges now found himself helping to build the first memories of an extraordinary child. "Did you know this plant has been used for thousands of years?" asked Nina, pointing to the small blue flower. "There are records of its medicinal use since ancient Egypt." "No, I didn't know that," he replied, genuinely interested. "Is that your knowledge or—" Nina thought for a moment, her forehead creasing in concentration. "Mine," she finally decided with a proud smile. "I read it in the botany book you gave me last week." Robert felt a wave of inexplicable emotion. This small moment of self-discovery, this clear separation between what was Nina and what were fragments of Lauren, represented a silent but significant victory. As they returned home in the late afternoon, Nina fell asleep in the back seat of the car. Observing her through the rear-view mirror, Robert realized that, for the first time in a long time, he felt complete. The emptiness that had accompanied him since Lauren's disappearance had been filled by something unexpected: love for this child, whom destiny, science, and his sister's desperation had placed in his path. On the horizon, the sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. A new day would come tomorrow, bringing with it challenges he couldn't predict, but also possibilities he was now eager to explore. Life, which for so long had seemed merely an interval between birth and death, something to be dissected and analyzed, had become again a vibrant mystery, a gift to be fully lived. Lauren's blue folder, now safely stored in a vault, contained secrets that could forever change the world of science. But his sister's true legacy slept peacefully in the back seat of his car, an extraordinary child who, despite her unusual origin, deserved the chance of a normal childhood, of discovering who she was for herself. When they arrived at the apartment, Robert carried the sleeping Nina in his arms. She was light as a feather, but the weight of his responsibility for her was immense, a weight he now carried not as a burden, but as a privilege. In the room that was once his study, and now belonged to Nina, with its walls painted light blue and luminous constellations on the ceiling, he carefully laid her on the bed. For a moment he stood watching her sleep, marveling at the complex miracle she represented, not just the scientific miracle that had allowed her unique existence, but the simpler and deeper miracle of how a child could completely transform the life of an adult hardened by time and loss. "Good night, Nina," he whispered, adjusting the blanket. As he closed the door, leaving it slightly ajar as she preferred, Robert smiled to himself. Life had strange and unexpected paths. The medical examiner who sought answers from the dead had finally found the most important answer among the living: that the human heart, no matter how long it remains dormant, never loses the capacity to awaken again to love. In the living room, while organizing the drawings Nina had made during the week, his phone rang. It was Mark. "Robert, we have news," said the investigator, his voice laden with contained excitement. "We found a trail of documentation in Canada, medical records of a woman with a description matching Lauren's, accompanied by a young woman who would be Sophie's age." Robert's heart accelerated, but the sensation was different now. It was no longer the solitary desperation that had consumed him for years, but a shared hope, a desire to complete the circle not just for himself, but for Nina too. "That's amazing, Mark. Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without visual confirmation," replied the investigator. "The partial biometric data we managed to obtain corresponds 87% with Lauren's last records. It's the best lead we've had in 15 years. "There's more," continued the investigator. "The woman works in a neurological research laboratory in Vancouver. And guess what her specialty is? Studies on epigenetic memory." Robert closed his eyes, allowing the emotion to completely invade him. After 15 years, There was finally a concrete clue, a real path that could lead him to Lauren and Sophie. When can we verify this information? I'm working with the Canadian authorities, replied Mark. We don't want to scare them if they really are your sister and niece. We need caution, but I believe in a few weeks we can have something concrete. Thank you, Mark, for everything. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we bring your sister home. After hanging up the phone, Robert remained motionless for a few moments, letting the possibility of a reunion with Lauren and Sophie permeate every fiber of his being. So many years of uncertainty, of unanswered questions, and now finally a light at the end of the tunnel. Who was it? Nina's soft little voice brought him back to reality. She was standing at the entrance to the living room, her hair disheveled. From sleep, her eyes still drowsy but curious. It was Mark, he replied, opening a smile. With good news. About Lauren? Robert nodded, extending his arms. Nina ran to him, who lifted her and sat her on his lap. There's a possibility that... We found her and Sophie. In Canada. Nina's eyes widened, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. So we're going to travel? Maybe soon, but first, we need to be sure. Nina was silent for a moment, processing the information. Then, with the disconcerting honesty that only children possess, she asked, "And if they don't want to meet me? If they think I'm weird?" Robert felt his heart tighten. Behind the simple question was a universe of insecurities that Nina, with all her extraordinary origin and capabilities, still struggled to manage. Lauren dedicated part of her life to creating you, Nina. You were important enough for her to entrust her most precious memories to you. I believe she'll be very happy to meet you in person. The girl rested her head on Robert's chest, a gesture of trust that still surprised him with its simplicity and depth. And if everything is different from what we expect? The question hung in the air, laden with possibilities. Robert knew that Nina wasn't referring only to the physical reunion, but to all the implications that would come after. What would the dynamics between all of them be like? How would Nina fit into a story that had begun even before her existence? How would Lauren react to seeing the result of her boldest experiment? Then we'll face it together, he replied, with a certainty that came not from reason, but from the heart. The important thing is that we're no longer alone, Nina. Neither you nor I. The girl smiled, satisfied with the answer. With the pragmatism that frequently surprised Robert, she jumped from his lap. We still have to finish my science project for tomorrow, she exclaimed, suddenly energized. I promised the teacher I'd bring the solar system model. Robert laughed, also standing up. That's true. And after, how about pizza for dinner? With pineapple, she replied, already running to get the project materials. Watching her disappear down the hallway, Robert felt a wave of gratitude that momentarily left him breathless. Regardless of what the future held, of what they would discover in Canada, one truth remained unshakable. Nina had transformed his life in ways he never imagined possible. The medical examiner who once believed he could only offer justice to the dead now knew that his greatest legacy would be the love he offered to the living. And as he walked to help Nina with her project, Robert recognized that in his obstinate quest to discover the fate of his lost sister, he had ended up finding something infinitely more precious, a new beginning,